President Cyril Ramaphosa has taken over the chairship of the African Union from Egypt's Abdel Fattah Sisi with a warning that the continent must deal with countries outside of Africa fighting proxy wars and fueling conflicts on the continent. Addressing the heads of state at this year's African Union summit, Ramaphosa announced that South Africa will host a special summit on silencing the guns in May, which is Africa Month this year, with the aim of coming up with a concrete solution to Africa's long-running conflicts. He laid out his top 3 priorities during his term, including conflict resolution, gender equality and climate change. Sarah Kimani now joins us live from Addis Ababa for an update. A very good morning to you, Sarah. Obviously, we hear the background sound, so still quite a lot of activity there at the summit.
Yes, indeed, a lot of activity here at the summit. Today is the last day of the summit, and most of the activities have actually concentrated around the conflicts on the continent. We had President Ramaphosa having meetings with President Salva Kiir of South Sudan and rebel leader Dr. Riek Machar, both meetings done separately in order to see if these two gentlemen can come to agreement to form a government of national unity ahead of the 22nd of February deadline for them to form this government. But he also had meetings with the UN Secretary General as well as the negotiators of a peace agreement in Libya. And he's also expected to have another meeting today about the Sahel region. Most of these meetings are concentrated around peace and security issues because the African Union has themed this year as the year of silencing the guns, meaning by the end of this year there should be not even one conflict on the continent. Quite a huge task, considering that there are 17 conflicts currently underway on the continent.
All right, you've touched on a bit on some of them, but let's just unpack the 3 resolutions of the president as he takes up chairships, the South African president: conflict resolution, gender equality and climate change. Take us through the important discussions that have been carrying on there with regards to these 3 resolutions.
I've talked about the one on conflict resolution, and for that, he will be holding a meeting in Johannesburg, he says, in May. But at the same time, during that summit, he will also hold another summit on the African Continental Free Trade Area. The idea is to see to it that the continent starts trading more with itself. But even here, he had a warning because he said that the continent must be very wary of goods coming into Africa under the guise that they're actually made in Africa. And so he said that the leaders here will be discussing exactly what is made in Africa, and laws are going to be formed so that then Africa does not become a pit stop or a dumping ground for products that come outside the continent, imported by Africans, and then these Africans try to trade these goods with other African countries. So, and then on gender equality, which he dwelt on for a very long time during his opening speech, he spoke about the need to include women in decision making, whether it is on conflict resolution, whether it is on political leadership. And he said also that if we are to uplift women on the continent, then we must give them a chance to do business. And so he's suggesting and proposing that from now on until 2030, the African Union declares that as the year of financial inclusion for women in Africa. So they will be doing issues, he will be asking African leaders to draft laws that concentrate on issues of giving women more procurement chances when it comes to government procurement. And then finally on climate change, he said that the continent will be sitting down with the developed world to see how they can begin to benefit from the Green Climate Fund, because he says already a lot of countries on the continent are feeling the heat following the effects of climate change. He gave the examples of Mozambique with Cyclone Idai and Cyclone Kenneth. He also spoke about the East African region, where we have seen a locust invasion from Somalia all the way to Uganda this morning. And so he says, unless the world moves in very quickly and helps Africa to adapt to the effects of climate change, then we're going to have issues of drought, and some economies are actually going to be wiped out.
A sense of gender representation at this particular summit, the women leaders who are attending there and their response to that 3rd resolution about, or the 2nd resolution about gender equality?
Interesting that you asked that, because when he was addressing a room almost full of men. The continent is dominated by men. As we speak now, we don't have a country that is led by a woman on the continent. And so probably this is where the continent should start, because if then these decisions are going to reach the women on the grassroots, it has to start now. And he spoke about it. He said women are demanding to be given leadership positions. They deserve to be given those leadership positions. And he gave examples of his country, South Africa. He spoke about Rwanda. He spoke about Ethiopia here, countries that he said have had women on the boardroom or women in decision making. He says they have head of states who are men have seen a change in how things are done in their own countries. And so he challenged his colleagues to begin including women in decision making so that then the continent can be uplifted.
Also, quite a lot of emphasis, but also representation by senior officials from the state of Palestine. Tell us what conversations were taking place around this particular issue there.
Well, every year during the African Union Summit, leaders from Palestine are invited, and because Africa sympathizes and is in solidarity with their cause. And indeed, yesterday, Africa sent out a very strong message to President Donald Trump, saying that the agreement that he called the deal of the year, declaring Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, they said that it is illegal. They said it is unilateral, and they said it only goes to muddy the waters in terms of the peace agreements or in terms of the one-party agreement, that one-state agreement that they have been talking about. And President Ramaphosa likened that to the Bantustan rule during the apartheid regime. The African Union also throwing in their caution and saying that unless Palestine is included and unless Palestine is on the table in decision-making, then anything that Israel and the U.S. does is not going to be considered as legal, and it only goes to alienate Palestine. And African Union saying they stand in solidarity with Palestine and the people of Palestine.
Now, a lot of excitement about the imminent Africa trade agreement, the free trade agreement that has just been signed, Zimbabwe coming on. Is there a sense of occasion amongst African leaders and African countries in terms of what this can do for the continental economy?
Yes, indeed. We are talking about trading with a billion people, a market of 1 billion people. They're talking about economies growing threefold. And one of the things that they're also saying is that at the moment, we only trade with the outside world. Trade between the continent is only 16%. And so they're talking about the opportunities that are there, not just for the continent, but also for millions of young people who do not have jobs, talking about the need now to think about digital technologies and how they can be used to spark growth on the continent. But most importantly, it is now time, they're sitting down now to talk about how then, what laws need to be in place before this can fully take effect, what needs to be done so that the goods that the continent trades with each other actually are manufactured on the continent. Because if the continent trades with each other, it means then that manufacturing will grow. But the president also spoke about infrastructure development. He says unless infrastructure on the continent is developed, it will be impossible for goods, for example, to move from Egypt to South Africa. So he talked about the need for rail networks, the need for road networks, and also the need for the open skies treaty between various countries on the continent to take effect and to be seen to be working. Also the opening of borders so that there is free movement of persons. And he called on countries to begin to provide free visa movements across the continent for all citizens of Africa.
And just finally, Sarah, just as a way of comparing, the last time South Africa was the chair of the African Union, there was a lot of excitement in terms of President Thabo Mbeki's commitment to Africa. But there were also concerns from several African leaders about South Africa seemingly being like the big brother of the continent. And there were a lot of back and forth in terms of this conversation. How has this particular chairship of President Cyril Ramaphosa been received?
Well, there is a lot of optimism that President Ramaphosa will offer leadership. Indeed, when the chairperson of the African Union Commission was addressing, he said, because the meeting was held right across me at the Nelson Mandela plenary hall, he said the spirit of Madiba is here and it's watching over President Ramaphosa. And so he must take the challenge and also know that he has a historical responsibility to offer leadership on the continent. We've seen congratulatory messages coming for President Ramaphosa from leaders from the East African region, from the West African region, all of them saying they look forward to having him take up the responsibility to help the continent silence the guns. Quite important, because already South Africa is playing a key role in silencing the guns in a lot of countries on the continent, from Congo, South Sudan, the Sahel region, Burundi. And so they are hoping that that same mediation efforts and guarantors of peace that they have been doing, that they will pick it up now and, spread it across the continent, because the continent now is worse off than it was in 2005 when there were just a few conflicts. We're talking about 17 active conflicts now. The UN are saying that this is 300% rise compared to 2005. So quite a challenge for President Ramaphosa and indeed for South Africa to offer leadership, not just here, but also the United Nations, where it is representing the continent.
Sarah, thank you so much for that update. Sarah Kimani there coming to us from Addis Ababa. But speaking about the spirit of Nelson Mandela, tomorrow, the 11th of February, 2020, will mark 30 years since the release of former late President Nelson Mandela from the Victor Verster prison. Quite a milestone for South Africa, and different ways that South Africans will be marking it, and it will be interesting to see how you remember that day.